Guys, this video is all about why mobility matters in the pigeon delivery. It's much more than just strength training. It's much more than just trying to throw things hard. So Lance McCullers is going to be a great example for demonstrating how that mobility appears in the delivery. So first thing, as we're getting into the stride, again, very internally rotated on that front hip. Okay, he has very good hip internal rotation on both sides. But right here, that's what we're seeing as he gets further out into the stride. Again, there needs to be a certain amount of hip abduction. So those adductors need to be flexible enough to allow him to keep his upper half back while striding down the mound. As we get into landing, you see that back hip fire. We need very good hip internal rotation on that back hip, and we also need hip extension. So the ability to extend the hip flexors inhibit that if you have tight hip flexors. As we get into this separated landing position, you need sufficient thoracic rotation, arm side thoracic rotation, in order to keep the shoulders back while the hips go. You also need sufficient shoulder internal rotation on that front shoulder, which aids in keeping that front shoulder closed. As he begins to rotate, you really see the emphasis on thoracic extension as that chest starts to jut forward towards the target. And you also see how important horizontal abduction is. So how much of a stretch he gets through the chest. We'll replay this again. How much stretch he gets through his chest at that landing position. So having very flexible pecs is important for being able to let the arm get back and apply force over a long arc of motion into release. So horizontal abduction. As we get into ball release, you'll see massive layback, which is a combination of true ball and socket external rotation, but also in combination with that thoracic extension and the posterior tilt of that throwing scapula. So allowing that arm to get additional layback to apply force to the ball over a longer arc of motion. What we see on this lead leg is the need for hip flexion. So in order to finish properly over that lead leg, you need flexible enough hamstrings to allow you to get that sufficient hip flexion. And you also need hip internal rotation on that lead leg to efficiently finish and rotate around that lead leg. What you're seeing more importantly in the upper half at this point is you need sufficient internal rotation on that throwing arm to allow the throwing arm to decelerate over a longer arc, not have such an abrupt, jerky deceleration after release. You need sufficient elbow extension, so you're not just slamming your elbow after ball release. You need sufficient pronation, and you also need sufficient scapular anterior tilt and protraction. So the scapula needs to be able to move and finish with your arm, similar to a guy like Max Scherzer, who's a very extreme example of that. You need to have the mobility elsewhere to make sure that you're not just slamming on the brakes, but able to decelerate that over a longer range of motion. So all these things come into play. It's not just being strong, it's not just being powerful, but it's having sufficient mobility and moving athletically through these patterns.